For letter W, I'm going to look at walking on water. This is a pretty famous story. Jesus walks on water. Peter walks on water for a little while. And we tend to make fun of him because he sank. But let's get into it, because I think Peter deserves more credit than he gets, even though Peter himself didn't seem to give himself much credit. Now, this whole thing, I'll show you why it matters later, but keep in mind, this happens right after the famous feeding of the 5,000. I'm not going to go into that whole story. Hopefully you know what I'm talking about. But when that's all done, Jesus sends the disciples on across the lake. He says, head on over there and I'll meet up with you. And nothing says how he was planning to get there, but the crowd that they just dealt with had walked around the edge of the lake and gotten there, so they probably figured he was going to do the same thing. But then they go all night fighting against this storm. They're rowing into a heavy wind and just not making any headway. Nothing says they were scared. And remember, half these guys were seasoned fishermen who spent their lives on this lake. So they're probably not freaking out, but they're just like, oh man, this is annoying. It's a rough night. But then, like 2 a.m. or so, Jesus shows up just like casually walking across the water. And I love that the Gospels tell us that he acted like he was going to walk right on by them. Like it was just, oh hey, Alex is going over there and he's on his way by. But they panic and freak out because, people don't walk on water. And so they thought it was a ghost. And Jesus says, guys, calm down, it's me. And Peter's reaction makes no sense to me, because he says, Jesus, if it's you, call me to come out to you. There's two reasons that's stupid. One, if it's not Jesus and it's actually the ghost that they're afraid it is, does anything stop a ghost from saying, well, sure, come on out, and then just laughing at Peter when he falls in the water? I don't know what Peter thought, though. Oh, well, if it's you, what that was proving. But the other thing wrong with if it's you is Jesus just said, it's me. So he's got to be like, yeah, I said it was me. Come on out, Peter, let's do this. But so Peter gets out of the boat and he's like, okay, Jesus, here I come. And for a little while, it works. I love that it works, and I'll get into that in a minute. But I want to know how long it worked. We don't know if this was, a second and a half, or if he was out there for a while and going like, oh my gosh, look at what I can do. Or if he was just like going and not noticing. I see this as a Wile E. Coyote moment. That, the stuff he'd be chasing the Roadrunner and somehow he'd end up running off the edge of a cliff and he just stands there on open air for a little bit and everything's fine. He doesn't fall until he notices it. When he looks down and goes, uh-oh, and usually holds up some sign, and then plummets. And I think that's what Peter did. He's out there walking towards Jesus and everything's going good until he looks around and goes, wait a minute, what am I doing? I can't walk on water, and he sinks. And I wonder if he just sank like a rock, or did he slowly sink like he's going in quicksand or something? Again, it doesn't say. We know he calls out to Jesus. Jesus immediately grabs him. They climb in the boat, where now Peter is the only wet guy out of 13 people. And the storm immediately stops. And I really like that Mark's gospel tells us that the disciples, everybody was amazed by this event. And he specifically points out because they hadn't gained any insight from what Jesus just did with the loaves and fishes. Now, that's really cool and important, because you have to recognize Mark's gospel, it's almost universally agreed that that was Peter's, account of the life of Jesus. This was the sermons that Peter preached all the time in Rome, basically. And after Peter died, Mark wrote it all down, so we would still have it. And so Peter's version of the story does not include Peter walking on water. It just talks about Jesus walking on the water. And I think either Peter wasn't proud of it because he sank and he had been made fun of for it or something, and he thought it wasn't his best moment, or possibly Peter just said, guys, me walking on water isn't the point of the story. And so he's focusing on the fact that Jesus came across the water. But then he pointed out that the only reason they were shocked by this whole thing is that they hadn't learned their lesson from the feeding the 5,000. And so what lesson was that they didn't learn? And I think it's just that these guys didn't recognize yet that Jesus was the Son of God. Like, they were still following a rabbi, a cool rabbi to be sure. Like, he's working miracles and casting out demons and feeds massive crowds with a little boy's sack lunch. Like, he's an awesome rabbi for sure. But they didn't recognize that they're dealing with God. And that's why when he does things like walk across water and calm a storm instantly, they're like, oh my goodness, who is this guy? Because when you recognize it's God, it changes everything. God doesn't have to play by the rules, so he can make a human walk on top of water, and he can make storms stop, and he can make food go as far as it needs to go. He can do any of that kind of stuff. He's God, he's allowed. But when they didn't realize who it was, like, none of this made sense to them. And it's also, that's what made it possible for Peter to walk on the water, is the fact that when God's word, told him to do it, it gave him the power to do it. When Jesus said, yeah, Peter, come on out, suddenly Peter was in fact able to do what is literally impossible. Peter knew full well that it was impossible to walk on the water, which is why he eventually sank. But he was able to do it for a while because he was obeying what Jesus told him to do. And it's a fantastic lesson that when Jesus tells you to do something, that gives you the power to do it. That makes the impossible possible because God said so.